When separate people, separated by miles and daily life, describe the same impossible detail, black suits, a small star emblem, a silence that swallows sound, attention shifts from idle curiosity to a question that cannot be shrugged off. What pattern are we looking at, and what might it mean? In the mid-1970s, in the wide, lonely spaces of rural Wyoming, a cluster of reports emerged that carried that same set of details. Men who had lived their lives hunting, ranching, and working the land suddenly described encounters with beings they called the Star People. These were not brief lights or distant objects in the sky. These were accounts that involved bodies, objects, altered landscapes, and later tangible oddities that complicated easy dismissal. Unlocking the secrets of the Star People requires both careful listening to those claims and a steady eye on the evidence they left behind. If you want the full investigation, subscribe and hit the bell to follow this series. Carl Hickton's story begins like many small-town cold morning tales, a man heading into the timber to hunt when a normal day becomes a fracture in time. According to his own later testimony, Hickton left his home with a calm routine and a rucksack, planning to hunt elk in Medicine Bow National Forest. He was a familiar figure to neighbors, reliable, taciturn, someone who knew the woods. What followed, as he reported it, was anything but ordinary. Hickton claimed that during a hunt he fired at an elk and felt the recoil, but the bullet did not behave as expected. He described a sensation of the world pausing, a violent, convulsive episode, and then a loss of memory for a span of hours. When he came to, he was disoriented and reportedly did not immediately recognize his wife when she found him. Hospital records and investigators' notes, as reported, documented his disorientation and medical evaluation. Physical examination would later reveal anomalies that Hickton and those who recorded his account found difficult to explain. The most striking physical artifact associated with his account was an object he and his wife found later, a perfectly flattened round in his pocket. That detail stands out not only because it seems to defy ordinary ballistics, but because it is the kind of small, concrete thing that shifts a story from mere testimony into material evidence. Hickton reported that items of his clothing and equipment were rearranged, and that a vehicle was found in a place that, according to investigators, did not show corresponding tire tracks. Those alleged vehicle placement anomalies, cars or trucks positioned without an obvious means of arrival or departure, would reappear in other accounts across the region. Hickton's recollection, given publicly in interviews and revisited under hypnosis at a later date, included sensory details that anchored the experience: a persistent silence, an intense brightness, a hovering figure taller than a man, dressed in a dark suit with a small star emblem at the chest. He later gave a name to one of the beings he encountered, Ozo-1, and described the interior of a craft as a cube-like silence, an environment in which movement and speech felt constrained. In the most disquieting passages of his account, Hickton described standing in an alien landscape, briefly among other human figures and animals, before waking up again in the Wyoming forest. Physical anomalies, as reported, followed his return. Hickton claimed that a kidney stone that had troubled him for years was missing after the incident. Scars he expected to find were reportedly healed. A bullet lodged in his clothing had been found perfectly flattened. Hospital documentation, according to investigators, recorded medical evaluations consistent with his confusion and the need to rule out head injury, but those records do not, and could not, explain the link between the claimed physiological changes and the encounter narrative. The presence of the flattened round, the missing stone, and healed scars became anchor points in the case, a cluster of details that invited deeper scrutiny. Those who investigated Hickton's account reported documenting changes not only to material items, but to behavior. Friends and neighbors, according to accounts, noticed shifts, a withdrawal from publicity, a reluctance to discuss certain details, and in some depictions a wariness toward those who sought him out with microphones and cameras. Hickton maintained a consistent core to his narrative across interviews, and whether one accepts each element as literal fact or not, the pattern of repeated, detailed claims from a single, steady source is part of what makes this case difficult to dismiss outright. The second central thread in this Wyoming cluster is the series of incidents reported by rancher Pat McGuire. Where Hickton's account centers on a personal disappearance and recovery, McGuire's story is anchored in the land itself. Cattle found in the morning altered in ways that defied normal predation, and nights filled with lights and a new, uncanny quiet. For ranchers, the land and the animals are intimately practical things. When those fundamentals are violated in ways that conventional explanations struggle to cover, suspicion and fear spread through the tight circles of rural communities. McGuire and those who worked for him documented repeated discoveries of cattle with precise surgical-style mutilations. Investigators who later looked at the scene reported details that did not fit with typical predator damage: cuts with clean edges, organs removed with a precision not consistent with scavenging, and very limited blood at some sites. These facts, when reported by the ranch hands and the local responders, shifted the event away from the common categories of rural loss. One night, during stakeouts intended to catch whatever was taking livestock, a young ranch hand named Jimmy Ashley described approaching a light and seeming to be engulfed in flame, yet emerging unburned. Ashley's episode, according to reports, made his co-workers uneasy. He had been seen near a hovering object appeared to be in a trance, and yet showed no burns afterward. Later still, hypnosis sessions used by McGuire and others to recover suppressed or fragmented memory produced accounts of beings in black suits taking tissue samples and delivering warnings about a coming climate catastrophe and advice to secure water and seed. Under hypnosis, McGuire claimed the Star People had instructed him to dig wells in spots he had previously believed barren. He later reported these wells yielded water, which magnified the ambiguity between potential psychological suggestion and a practical material change in his environment. As with Hickton, social consequences followed the McGuire incidents. The rancher, who once had standing in his community and even harbored modest political ambitions, found his reputation eroding as neighbors, and voters debated the veracity and meaning of his claims. Attempts at public life faltered, and social isolation increased. Whether the isolation derived from fear, mockery, or genuine disbelief, the human cost became part of the broader story. Extraordinary claims often create ordinary ruin. Across both cases, there are recurring descriptive motifs that invite comparison. Witnesses independently reported beings in dark clothing with a recognizable star emblem, large eyes, and minimal facial features. These beings moved without audible step sounds. Their presence carried a kind of enforced stillness, a silence that dominated a scene. Objects described as craft hovered with a metallic sheen and emitted lights that were sometimes observed at close range. Investigators reported similar physical anomalies in both narratives: items flattened or altered in ways that seemed inconsistent with common mechanical forces, unexplained healing of wounds, and vehicle placements without corresponding tracks. The phrase "Star People" in these accounts functions both as a descriptive tag and as a motif that ties otherwise separate reports together. It is a shorthand used by witnesses to convey not only appearance, but a sense of otherness, beings who come from the stars or who are somehow linked to them. Whether the term represents an interpretation by the witnesses or an accurate description of origin, its persistence across multiple testimonies is notable and central to the pattern investigators were trying to unlock. Investigators who examined these reports moved cautiously. The investigative methods reported in the files blend conventional police work with more contested techniques. Police logs, where present, recorded calls and scene visits. Medical records documented symptoms, confusion, and physical evaluations. Hypnosis was used as a tool in some interviews to recover memory fragments, but those sessions have to be treated with the caution that modern science prescribes. Hypnosis can produce vivid recollections, but it can also produce confabulation or be influenced by suggestion. In discussion of the Wyoming material, records show both the use of hypnosis and the reservations some investigators recorded about accepting hypnotically recovered memories as conclusive. Skeptics pointed to alternative explanations that required less metaphysical reach. Animal predation and human tampering can account for some forms of livestock injury, Natural healing and medical anomalies can sometimes be misinterpreted as miraculous recovery. Equipment failure or misreadings can create the illusion of missing tracks. Investigators reported conducting background checks and comparing witness statements for consistency. They analyzed photographs and footage when available, looking for conventional sources of light or evidence of hoax. In the Hickton case, for instance, footage and photographs were examined and subject to question. The flattened round was photographed and handled with care because it functioned as a possible physical trace of an otherwise exceptional claim. Yet the Wyoming accounts resist simple collapse into a single skeptical explanation. The flattened round, the missing kidney stone reported by Hickton, and the claims of wells appearing where none existed after Maguire's instructions under alleged counsel from the Star people are details that have material weight. They are the kinds of facts that force an investigator to ask whether accepted paradigms fully encompass what happened. Records and witness recollections present a sequence of events that is internally consistent within each witness's narrative and that shares elements across multiple narratives. That pattern, consistent description amid unrelated witnesses, opens the possibility that something beyond ordinary explanation occurred, or that multiple ordinary factors converged in unusually synchronized ways. Understanding how to weigh those possibilities requires attention to the environment in which the incidents occurred. Rural Wyoming in the 1970s was, in geographic reality, a place of isolation and expanses. Geography matters. Vast distances reduce casual witness overlap, and the social textures of small communities, where reputations are built on decades of familiarity, make public claims a decision with social cost. If a known respected hunter tells a story that jars communal expectations, the reaction will be severe simply because the claim is incongruent with the teller's established persona. That social cost explains in part why the human fallout, mockery, loss of political chances, strained marriages, features in the investigative narrative almost as prominently as physical evidence. Hypnosis as a memory recovery tool needs an additional layer of scrutiny. In the Wyoming material, hypnotic regressions yielded detailed descriptions that witnesses had not disclosed publicly before. For some listeners, those detailed accounts bolster credibility. For others, they introduce the risk that memory has been molded by questioning and suggestion. Investigators recorded both the rich detail these sessions produced and their methodological caveats. The use of hypnosis highlights a central tension of the entire field. Human memory is a source of information and a vulnerable instrument. How much can a hypnotically recovered memory tell us about an experienced external event versus an internally constructed narrative that satisfies the mind's need for coherence after a disrupted period? Medical anomalies in the Hickton case are another sticking point. Reports of a missing kidney stone and of healed scars challenge easy categorization. Medical records, according to investigators, confirmed that Hickton had sought care and that doctors noted certain anomalies in his body and in his mental state. Those records do not provide an explanation for the alleged removals or healings. They do, however, serve as a neutral baseline. They show a man whose body and behavior had changed after an event he could not fully explain. The presence of physical data, whether a flattened round, a healed scar, or the absence of a previously recorded stone, insists that the investigation cannot remain purely in the domain of belief. Physical traces demand a forensics-level attention that in these cases met the limits of local resources and the investigative tools of the time. The accounts of vehicle placement without corresponding tire tracks raise technical questions. How does a vehicle come to be located where no tracks lead to it? Investigators reported noting the odd absence of impressions where vehicles should have come and gone. Several possible explanations exist: misreporting of initial positions, subsequent clearing of tracks by wind or water, or human relocation of the vehicle by someone who could bypass detection. Each explanation has strengths and weaknesses depending on weather, ground cover, and witness timings. Records show that investigators considered and ruled in or out these alternatives in some instances, but in other instances, the absence of a clean resolution remained. Where the Wyoming narratives cast a longer shadow is in their social aftermath. Hickton, once willing to speak publicly in interviews, increasingly withdrew from the spotlight, reported friends observed. Maguire's social trajectory took him from local standing to a contested figure, whose credibility was repeatedly challenged. Searches for corroboration, neighbors who saw the same lights, independent responders who could testify to the state of a ranch in the morning, produced a mixed record. Sometimes independent observers reported seeing strange lights or finding evidence. Other times, minutes and hours could not be reconciled. The net result for both men, however, was the erosion of a once ordinary life into a contested, partly ostracized one. That erosion is a human cost that investigators recorded with clinical attention. Reputations damaged, family relationships strained, and livelihoods affected by the suspicion and gossip that attach to extraordinary claims. This part of the story is not sensational. It is real, mundane, and devastating in a way that is often overlooked when the focus is placed on lights and craft. Reporting that neglects the human fallout misses how extraordinary events, or the perception of them, can ripple outward to affect the most ordinary parts of a life. Beyond the human cost, the recurring emblematic imagery, the star buckle, the black suits, the large eyes, constitutes a visual lexicon that threads the cases together. Investigators noted that when different witnesses described beings, those descriptions contained overlapping features in detail that would be unusual if each account sprang from wholly independent cultural influences. The specificity of the star emblem, for instance, functions as an identifying motif in testimony. It appears repeatedly as a small, distinct marking on the suits of the described beings. Whether that marking is literal, symbolic, or part of a shared interpretive framework cannot be determined with the records available, but its repetition is a pattern any thorough investigator must account for. The motif of hovering was similarly consistent. Witnesses described craft that did not land in the conventional sense, but maintained a position above the ground, seemingly unaffected by terrain. Lights were reported as both bright and diffuse, sometimes pulsing, sometimes steady. The soundscape in most of the accounts was notable by its absence. Silence is described as though it were a tangible thing. Taken together, appearance, emblem, hovering, silence, the motifs form an archetype that reappears across the related reports. Investigators attempted to treat the material as evidence rather than folklore. Policing records were recorded, documented calls, scene visits, and actions taken. Photographs and physical artifacts were catalogued. Where possible, analysts examined items like the flattened round using standard tools of evidence handling. Yet investigations in rural areas in the 1970s encountered practical limitations. Forensic laboratories were not always immediately accessible. Chains of custody could be imperfect. Witness recollection faded or shifted with time. These limitations do not prove or disprove the accounts. They only shape the contours of what can reasonably be asserted in support of any given conclusion. It is worth pausing on the phenomenon of consistent description across witnesses who had no direct known contact. The possibility that such consistency could arise from shared cultural narratives, media influence, or communal suggestion cannot be discounted. Yet the timing and geographic spread of the reports complicate that explanation. In small rural communities, news travels, but simultaneous detailed descriptions from people who did not appear to communicate with each other provoke an investigator's curiosity. Records show that some cross-checking was done. Investigators compared statements, timelines, and physical evidence when possible, and that some correlations held up under scrutiny, while others did not. This blend of corroboration and inconsistency is perhaps the defining analytic challenge. Physical traces exist in places: a flattened round, found and photographed, a well that produced water where one had not seen it before, and scars that healed in puzzling ways. Testimony exists, sometimes consistent, sometimes fragmented. Investigative work exists, sometimes thorough, sometimes constrained by resources. The proper interpretive posture here is one of guarded curiosity, to take seriously the reported material without leaping to an explanatory model that the evidence does not unequivocally support. What then can be proposed without overreach? One reasonable framing is that a set of anomalous events occurred in a particular time and place, reported by credible witnesses whose lives were disrupted as a consequence. Those events are associated with certain recurring motifs, black suits, star emblem, hovering craft, and also with physical anomalies that, while not conclusive in themselves, are odd enough to merit further inquiry. Another framing is that a complex socio-cultural process was at play. Stress, sleep disturbances, suggestion, and the human mind's tendency to produce narrative coherence after a period of puzzling experience could have combined to produce similar reports. Both frames and others might carry explanatory power. None alone closes the question entirely. The question of whether such events continue today is one that the title of this investigation invites. If a pattern existed in the 1970s, if a motif of star people and procedural anomalies did appear, then either the phenomenon recurred in other times and contexts, or it was a particular confluence of factors momentary to that place and period. Contemporary investigations into related phenomena often find echoes of the motifs reported in Wyoming. Recurring descriptions, unexplained physical traces, and social fallout for those who speak publicly. Whether those echoes represent the same agent of causation or a repeated human pattern of perception remains an open question. One of the most responsible ways to proceed is to continue documenting carefully. Physical artifacts matter. If a flattened round can be examined with modern forensic methods, the results could provide additional constraints on interpretation. Medical records preserved and reviewed by independent physicians can shed light on claimed physiological changes. Witness testimony, when recorded under controlled conditions and with awareness of the pitfalls of memory recovery techniques, can be a resource rather than a trap. Hypnosis, as a tool, should be used sparingly and with clear acknowledgement of its limits, cross-referenced with other evidence whenever possible. At the same time, investigators and consumers of these stories alike must maintain an ethical posture toward the human beings who have already paid a price. Hickton's retreat from publicity and Maguire's social marginalization are part of the evidence set. They tell us how communities respond when ordinary people tell extraordinary things. Treatment of witnesses, public skepticism without cruelty, careful verification without sensationalism remains essential to any credible inquiry. The unresolved tension at the heart of these Wyoming cases is not merely academic. It is a moral and epistemic puzzle. On one hand stands material detail, the flattened round, the missing kidney stone, the appearance of wells, the forensic oddities in cattle. On the other hand stands the human reality of memory, suggestion, and social dynamics that can shape how events are remembered and interpreted. When these vectors point in the same direction, the investigation must neither reflexively endorse nor dismiss. It must open and test, gather and weigh. In the final measure, the phrase "unlocking the secrets of the star people" is less a promise of a single answer than an instruction in method. Unlocking implies patience, the right tools, care to avoid forcing the lock. The Wyoming accounts do not hand any investigator a simple key. They hand instead a set of patterns, motifs, artifacts, behavioral changes that act like pins in a complex mechanism. Whether that mechanism opens to reveal a conventional explanation, a new natural phenomenon, or something we do not yet have the language to describe, is the question that remains. Did the star people ever truly leave? The record from mid-1970s Wyoming cannot close that question. What it can do is demand that those who study such claims maintain both empathy for the witnesses and rigor in the scrutiny of the evidence. Physical traces deserve modern re-examination when possible. Recollections should be treated with care, neither idolized nor scorned. And the social consequences of belief, shame, isolation, loss of livelihood, must factor into any ethical approach to reporting and investigating. If these events were a window into something beyond ordinary explanation, then the patterns we see, the emblem, the suits, the hovering, are clues. If they were the product of human perception and shared cultural framing, then those same patterns tell us about the fragile ways communities process fear and the unknown. Either conclusion, and the many possibilities between them, insist on further work rather than final pronouncements. At the end of this segment, the story remains both haunting and instructive. Two men, both tied to the land, reported encounters that altered their bodies, their reputations and their lives. The catalogue of oddities, Flattened metal, healed wounds, absent stones, wells that emerged, sits beside the testimonies of neighbors, hospital staff, and investigators who documented what they could. The star emblem and black suits reappear in accounts across miles, forming a thread that binds separate narratives into a pattern worthy of attention. We close then on the question the title asks us to carry forward. If the star people were present in Wyoming, then what does that pattern mean now? Is it an isolated knot of anomalies in a particular time and place, or is it a recurring signal that requires new ways to see and measure the world? The record does not give a final answer. What it does offer is a set of clues and consequences that demand continued, careful inquiry. Share your theories in the comments and watch our deep dive for the full evidentiary breakdown.